Good afternoon. It's Tuesday, the 5th of June 2018, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. I'm your host, Brian Gerrish. With me in the studio, of course, Mike Robinson. We'll also be joined by Mark Anderson today. Can I just say, Mike, with a hint of nostalgia, that it took me 8.5 hours to travel from Plymouth over to Cambridge on Friday, and that took me back to the 1970s so that we can see the progress made on Britain's smart motorways over that period of time. I just wanted to bring in the word nostalgia because I hope that we'll be giving Demos a little bit of a mention later in the programme.
Absolutely, but let's get straight on with Theresa May. Now, it was just 2 weeks ago that Theresa May announced her plans to publish a white paper. She said, I will publish ahead of a critical Brussels summit next month, this month now, a Brexit white paper setting out my priorities for Britain's future relationship with the European Union. And the intention was that this document would be published before the upcoming Heads of Government meeting in Brussels, and that would present what was being described as a detailed, ambitious and precise explanation of what the final deal would be. But unfortunately for Theresa, of course, she was going to have to include something about the customs union and the single market, and this has not been agreed, and there's all this trouble within the cabinet. It's split. Some people want to do it one way, other people want to do it another way. So unfortunately another deadline has been missed, and therefore what she said would have said is, I will publish ahead of a critical Brussels summit next month a Brexit white paper setting out my priorities for Britain's future relationship with the European Union, or not, because she's not. So there you go. It is a shame, Brian, but as time goes on, it looks more like we were right from the beginning. It is going to be Brexit without the exit because nobody can agree what the exit is going to be. And I'm just going to say again, it staggers me that anybody that was a Brexit supporter or is a Brexit supporter ever trusted this woman or any of her colleagues in her cabinet to take people out of the European Union.
That's true. The other clue we get to this, of course, is that massive attack on UKIP. So UKIP at the moment still in utter turmoil. So that means that the 70 million voters that voted to come out of the European Union were left without any form of flagship at all. And of course, UKIP at the moment not picking up on those 17 million voters. So everything's now delay, smokescreen, obfuscation. And what are they relying on? That people are just going to forget that they were ever promised Brexit?
Don't think that's going to happen, but certainly they're going to get it to a point where the demands for a second referendum are unstoppable, because, of course, there's not going to be a sensible deal put on the table. So, well, we wait and see if we're right or not. In the meantime, the European Union now has decided to get on board with Matthew Hancock, Secretary of State for Digital Culture, Media and Sport. And they've launched this communication on tackling online disinformation, a European approach. This is dated April 2018, but this approach has been building momentum over the last number of weeks, and it's been in the press once again today. So what are they talking about? Pretty much the same as what Matthew Hancock was talking about. Stepping up efforts to fight disinformation online, about helping underpin the mainstream media, focusing on improving transparency, promoting media diversity, fostering credible sources of information, did I say forcing? That was a bit of a Freudian slip there. Credible sources of information and devising long-term solutions to tackle disinformation in Europe. Now, of course, promoting media diversity and only supporting credible sources of information, or what they describe as credible sources of information, may be a bit oxymoronic, but anyway, we were moronic at the very least, but we get on with it. The announcement comes at a time, they said, when the European Union's existing in-house efforts against disinformation are under fire. Its EU versus Disinfo campaign, which was launched by a unit known as the East Stratcom Task Force, with the aim to better forecast, address and respond to pro-Kremlin disinformation, has been criticised over the involvement of EU civil servants. Well, indeed, and we covered that at the time. So in the meantime, they've released a new code of practice on how to fight disinformation, and that's going to be published in full by July. and they are helping online platforms harmonize their approaches to provide clear guidance on how they operate. This is pretty much in line with what Matthew Hancock had previously announced in the UK, supporting what they describe as credible mainstream media sources. Well, typical EU promoting media diversity, but while shutting down any dissenting voices, because that would be what they need to do.
It's demonstration they are incredibly fearful, Mike. So if anybody's looking for what can we do, the exposure, get the real information out there is clearly a major problem for them.
Absolutely. Now, let's bring Mark Anderson into the programme. Now, Mark, Bilderberg begins to, well, the informal part of it begins tomorrow, but they have released a press release explaining what's on the topics for discussion this year, and also listing who's attending. So, what are your thoughts?
It's very interesting, guys. Two of their top topics this year are free trade and populism in Europe. And the populism thing is really key among the 12 topics for this year. And they have 128 members from 31 countries, I believe, that are attending. But among the 12 topics, and those being free trade and populism in Europe being of particular interest, the populism thing carries over from the Trilateral Commission meeting, which was in late 2017 here in the UK. It also goes hand in hand with the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, which as of tomorrow starts their Global Cities Forum, the annual Global Cities Forum there in Chicago. And so from the Chicago Council to the Trilateral Commission to Bilderberg, we see a unbroken chain, this concern about populism in the United States, in Europe, and expressed in the form of Brexit. And so that's a very expected in a way, but very interesting topic for Bilderberg to handle this year. And then free trade being another topic, that's coming right as the British press, along with the American press, but especially the British press, is attacking Trump. And the G7, another thing just happened. It just wound up in, I believe it just wound up, or it's getting together in Quebec. I forget the exact dates of the G7. It's in Quebec, Canada, and they're attacking the Trump plan for tariffs and free trade, of course, also being on the Bilderberg and trilateral agendas. They're very concerned about Trump being more nationalistic, enforcing tariffs. Tariffs are always a bad thing. The press here and in the United States always, whenever Trump says anything negative about free trade or tariffs or the rules-based international order, those sorts of things, they simply line up a bunch of critics and tell us how bad tariffs are and how deplorable it is for Trump to challenge any part of the Bilderberg universe, you might say. But a number of other things could be said about Bilderberg. One thing that we've discovered in our research today here at the UK column, where I'm coming to you from, I'm at your offices for listeners that might want to know that, is that there's the Bilderberg Association, and that is a charity that was unbeknownst to us, as I understand it, and they go hand in hand with the American Friends of Bilderberg, and that's very interesting there as well. Maybe you're going to bring that up later, but Zanny Minton Beddoes of The Economist, she's one of 12 journalists attending Bilderberg this year. About 10% of the Bilderberg attendees are journalists that leave their notebooks and ethics at the door. Zanny Minton Beddoes of The Economist is also a trustee with the Bilderberg Association, the charity, which is registered here in the UK, along with Lord John Kerr. So this charity, which also has connections to the Netherlands, is something I'm going to be looking into a lot for articles that will be appearing in American Free Press, on my blogs, and perhaps in 21st Century Wire and or the UK column as well. So this Bilderberg Association is a new kid on the block in terms of our research. It's been there a while, but kind of hidden in the shadows. And there's some other newbies here at Bilderberg this year, some interesting newcomers. One of them is John Hickenlooper, the Colorado governor. Oftentimes, one or two U.S. governors will show up every so often And John Hickenlooper of Colorado is the latest of U.S. governors to have attended Bilderberg. Others have included Rick Perry of Texas, the former governor there. And as I mentioned, there's 12 journalists, and a carryover from the G7 in Quebec that wound up is Dominique Anglade. She's the Deputy Premier Minister of Economy, Science, and Innovation in Quebec, and she's a carryover from the G7, and she's at Bilderberg for the first time, and she carries with her very strong concerns that Trump is enacting tariffs against aluminum and steel. And that is, bear with me, that is 25% on steel and 10% on aluminum. Canada's all up in arms about that. And this G7 import into Bilderberg this year in Italy, meeting in Turin, Italy, June 7 through 10 officially, is this lady from the ministry there in Canada. So a lot going on, a lot of spokes going into the hub, you might say. And one other thing I'll mention briefly is Justin Trudeau, the Canadian PM, looking at Trump's tariffs on even aluminum from Canada, said the idea that we are somehow a national security threat to the United States is quite frankly insulting and unacceptable. But this is a complete distortion, because when Trump enacted the tariffs on aluminum and steel under a national security rubric, what he meant was that for a nation to be secure, it needs to be self-sufficient in certain raw materials, in certain important metals, in certain natural resources. It wasn't a slight against Canada or any one nation. It was simply a reasonably sovereign move by the U.S. to improve its material security for national security purposes. It did not mean, as Trudeau suggested, that the U.S. considers Canada any kind of a security risk. So I know I'm covering a lot of ground here. There's a lot that could be said, but a lot more will be coming out of Bilderberg in the days ahead. But there's very definite connections to what the Trilateral Commission covered in November. And so it really shows, as I've often said, that Bilderberg is a network, and it's the main hub, the most exclusive hub. And the Trilateral Commission and these other organizations, even the G7 to some extent, are spokes into that hub. And the continuity on the populism issue and the nationalism issue, and the continuity, the carryover on criticizing Trump for tariffs and the free trade issue, it just shows how these issues carry over from one group to another and feed into this Bilderberg hub for further action and further contemplation on their part.
Okay, thanks for that, Mark. Now, just before we move on from this, I wanted to mention the 11 British attendees, Brian, because Marcus Agius, of course, is there once again, ex-Barclays Bank and BBC. Mark Carnage is there, Mark Carney, Governor of the Bank of England. Who else is standing out for me is, Mark's already mentioned Zanny Minton-Beddoes, but George Osborne will be there. Not quite sure if this constitutes another job for George Osborne, but of course he has about 6 jobs at the moment, including the London Evening Standard editor. And Amber Rudd will be there, which is quite amusing, bearing in mind she's just lost her job.
Yeah, fascinating.
So I presume the invitation went out to Amber Rudd before she lost her job, and maybe they just were embarrassed to revoke it or something. But she's on the list, so that's it.
And no proper analysis or comments or questions from mainstream media. It's just reported that there'll be a little bit in the paper that the Bilderberg Group has met. Nobody will ask, why did they meet?
No, indeed. Also on the list of subjects, Mark, just briefly, obviously the future of work and artificial intelligence is on there. Also Russia, but the post-truth world is on there as well. Of course, we are living in the post-truth world. And I believe that is a policy rather than a sort of statement of reflecting what's going on in the world. They intend to sort of build this notion of the post-truth world and continue pushing as much chaos and untruth and disinformation into the system as possible. Of course, the targets of their allegations of disinformation do not include the mainstream media, who are the main sources of quite a large proportion of the disinformation that's out there. But it's just interesting to see this post-truth world narrative on the agenda for this year, Mark.
Oh, absolutely. If you look at the trilateral
Mark, have you muted yourself?
Sorry about that. If you look at pardon that minor blip. If you look at the Trilateral Commission from late last year, and you consider everything else we've heard, the Trilaterals, to their credit, did publish a overview or summary of their meeting in November of last year in the UK, and it talks about the causes of this populist nationalist thing they're so worried about, and they conflate nationalism and populism, saying that all nationalists are populists and all populists would be fascists and that sort of thing. But they say another cause of all the chaos they see from a globalist point of view is the internet and other forms of digital technology. This is their exact words, which is both amplifying the voices of radicals and has the potential to bring about a big restructuring of the economy. So amplifying the voices of radicals, that came off the lips of the Trilaterals. And this is no doubt a carryover into Bilderberg this year, because from the demos, stuff that you guys talked about yesterday and went into detail on the UK column, from demos to trilaterals to even what Richard Haas told the House of Lords recently in a private video conference, the concerns from Brexit, from Trump being elected, from the voices on the internet, the radical voices, to loss of faith in free trade, to protectionist measures like tariffs. All these things are circulating around, from Richard Haas to the CFR to the Trilaterals to the Bilderberg Group, and yes, the voices of the alternative media, as you're saying, Mike, in terms of what's going on, they're very concerned about that, and they're intimating and hinting around that they want to crack down on it. But I think, quite honestly, they're rather nervous about what they call the populist uprising. And that shorthand populist, that is their word, not ours, I would mention. People in our circles don't even really use the word populist very much. This is what the globalist and the globalization fanatics, the transnationalists, this is their words. This is their shorthand. So they are clearly going from the offensive to almost the defensive here for the first time in maybe decades.
Brilliant, thank you, Mark. Let's move on then. Sabre Strike 2018 has kicked off in the Baltics and in Poland. So there's thousands of troops taking part in this NATO exercise. It's 2 weeks. It began on Sunday. 18,000 soldiers from 19 countries with troops deployed in Poland and the Baltic states. The US Army Europe website, which is on screen at the moment, says Sabre Strike 18 is not a provocation of Russia, but is an exercise with our allies designed to enhance readiness and interoperability amongst allies and regional partners, demonstrate the alliance's determination and ability to act as one in response to any aggression. So it's not, Brian, a provocation against Russia, which is why it's taking place against the border with Russia.
Well, that's it. That's all that needs to be said. Obviously, we've seen these troop deployments to the former eastern states, and it continues to go on, plus the exercises right up to the Russian borders. So, of course, it's going to have an effect on the Russians. And NATO knows it, which is why they're doing it.
Absolutely. Now, Times of Israel explaining why Jens Stoltenberg was talking about whether Israel came under the auspices of Article 5 or not. They're saying Israel takes part in NATO's Sabre Strike drill for the first time, and indeed they are. What's interesting about this is that apparently one of the scenarios that they are running during these exercises is how a nation would handle an armed insurgency from within its own borders. So is that why Israel's taking part? I don't know the answer to that at this point. Again, they reiterate in this article that this is not a provocation of Russia. I suggest they probably protest too much there. It's a demonstration of the commitment and solidarity of the alliance, so that's great. Israel is a partner, of course, of NATO and not a member of NATO, and that's why it does not come under the auspices of Article 5. Now, in the meantime, lots going on with defence pacts involving the UK, and it began a couple of weeks ago with Matthew Hancock getting involved with the Singaporean authorities. This is Singaporean Foreign Minister signing a memorandum of understanding on the issue of cyber warfare. So it was signed by Dr. Vivian Balakrishnan. Sorry, I should have practiced this before I came on the programme, but this is Singapore's Minister for Foreign Affairs on behalf of the Government of Singapore and the Right Honourable Matt Hancock, MP, Secretary of State for Digital Culture, Media and Sport. And of course, the signing ceremony was held at the department itself. And it builds on and extends on the close cooperation already existing between the two countries under the Memorandum of Understanding on Cybersecurity Cooperation signed between the Cybersecurity Agency of Singapore and the UK Cabinet Office in 2015. Undoubtedly debated in Parliament, agreed in Parliament,
or
not. But so why are we mentioning this? Well, because it goes further. Yesterday, Gav the Chav was in Singapore. He had been speaking at the Shangri-La Dialogue Asia Security Summit in Singapore, and he had emphasised the need for partners to come together to tackle shared and increasing challenges. So this is fantastic. He said, standing united with allies is the most effective way to counter the intensifying threats we face from countries that don't respect international rules, like Britain, France, the United States, who don't go to the Security Council. Anyway, we move on. He said, together with our friends and partners, we will work on a more strategic and multinational approach to the Indian Ocean region, focusing on security, stability, and environmental sustainability to protect our shared prosperity. And so they've signed a memorandum of understanding. It's an agreement involving to deal with defence cooperation, the first memorandum of understanding on defence between the two countries. It covers the existing defence relationship and areas of cooperation, as well as providing a foundation for future defence cooperation in some more specific areas. So as you can see, they're being very specific about what those areas are by not listing them. But apparently it is going to involve cooperation on several fronts, from cyber defence technology, non-conventional warfare to counter-terrorism, as well as maritime security and disaster relief. So that's good. Another day, another bilateral defence agreement.
Not debated in Parliament at all.
Indeed.
Yeah.
Well, it was on and then it was off. Now it's back on again. Apparently the first Trump-Kim meeting is going to take place on the 12th of June. So that's a good piece of news. We're actively preparing for the June 12th summit between the President and North Korean leader, said Sarah Sanders yesterday. And we feel things are continuing to move forward. A good progress has been made. So that's pretty good.
Excellent. Well, I thought I'd just pop this one in because it amused me this morning. Somebody sent it through to me. So Brian Becker had tweeted out, check your sources. North Korean official Ri Yong-gil, who'd been executed by Kim Jong-un in 2016, according to the BBC, Yonhap and other media, is now reported to have been named the new Army Chief of General Staff in North Korea.
Well, is this some kind of zombie army?
Oh, well. So I just thought that was really excellent. So there we are, the BBC on a budget of £3.74 billion. You can trust them to report the news, except where you can't.
Yes, indeed.
But there we are. So, yeah, the first zombie army or something else extraordinary happening in Korea.
Okay, the House of Commons International Development Committee has been questioning the use of international development money. And this is quite interesting in many ways because it really reflects some of the stuff that we've been talking about, Brian, over the last number of weeks, reminding people, for example, about the activities of BBC Media Action in Kazakhstan and particularly in Syria. And they were highlighting, amongst other things, the Foreign Commonwealth Office administered Prosperity Fund projects. They say we found many weaker examples, including projects to develop the Chinese film industry, improve the Chinese museum infrastructure, and improve the credit bond rating system in China. But there's 2 points here. First of all, why would international development money need to be going into China at all? I do question why the Chinese would allow this money to go in, but of course, money is flowing into China, into NGOs and other things all the time, and China really needs to start paying attention to where that money is coming from and what it's being used for. But why would the Foreign and Commonwealth Office want to be developing the Chinese film industry, I wonder?
Soft power comes into my mind, Mike. Soft power, but I come back to nostalgia and that 8.5 hour road trip, where of course, aside from the complete chaos and the roadworks, all of the major roads full of the most unbelievable potholes. Dangerous potholes. We can't fix the potholes in Britain's roads, but we have got money to give to the Chinese for their film industry. So this is the priority of the British government. And of course, they're not doing that for fun. They're doing it in order to project the soft power. So forget about the NHS or the motorways or problems with your streets and drains and rubbish collections. The important thing is the British government has got enough money to develop the Chinese film industry.
Just before we move on from that, I will mention that report also discusses the Conflict Stability and Security Fund, which of course is the fund that has bunged £200 million or so to the White Helmets. So I do recommend people have a look through that report and just see what their foreign aid money is being spent on, aside from the Chinese film industry.
Yeah. Well, let's stay on what's happening in the UK. And thank you to a viewer who sent this alert through to me. So it's Sajid Javid's Twitter page. And what was of interest, well, aside from welcome to the district of Bromsgrove, there was an article or a tweet straight under that. Let's bring it full on screen for you. What was this about? Well, it says, another terror plot thwarted by @Terrorism Police and @Met Police UK, working with MI5 and others. #Action counters terrorism. Find out how you can keep us all safe. So this is a pretty exciting thing. And the main article from Met Police was mother and daughters guilty of plotting terrorist attack. And that took you through to the Met Police news site. What was interesting was down here there were some public comments which caught my eye, because we had Lone Voyager saying, and remember this is the Home Secretary's Twitter page, says please transport to airbase, place in rear of transport plane, fly over Atlantic, open cargo doors at operating altitude, use size 10 to boot all 4 out, return to base, job done. And the one underneath was a bit more explicit. It said, should be killed. No room for that in this world. So here we've got the British Home Secretary, who's at the moment ramping up to anybody who they say is helping to promote terror and abuse or racial hatred. And yet where can you find it? On his personal Twitter page. Quite remarkable. But here's the article. Let's get into a bit more of the detail over it. This was the image that the Met Police had put forward. They're gloating that this is a major terrorist attack which has been foiled. But when you got into the article, it got more interesting. I'll read a little bit. It said, however, while she'd been on police bail, Safa remained in contact with the person she planned to marry in Syria. It was during this time on bail that Safa shifted her attention from travelling out to Syria to committing an attack in the UK. Unbeknown to Safa, people she was discussing her attack with online were not fellow extremists, but online, quote, role players from the security services. Believing she was communicating over encrypted and secure apps, Safa discussed her plans and desire to get hold of firearms and grenades, or pineapples as they were referred to. She also discussed with them potential targets in central London and the possibility of using a vehicle and a knife to carry out an attack as an alternative to firearms. Now, my question here is, was this a genuine threat or was there entrapment going on? And I have to say, I've got an uneasy feeling now about what our security services are really doing. If they're online role-playing, they say to her, would you like some grenades as well? Did they say that to her?
Have they any evidence that she wasn't online role-playing?
We don't know, but follow this through, because where does this take us? Well, it takes us through to this sort of stuff. We've got action counters terrorism. So this is @Terrorism Police, where the police are boasting that they're now patrolling the streets of London and other places, deterring criminal activity, informing, reassuring, and I found this fascinating, recruiting the public.
Yeah.
So we've got online actors. We don't quite know what those people are doing. Could they be entrapping people? Well, the police have done this before. Certainly the security services have done it. But now we're recruiting members of the public. I always come back to the Stasi because this is the style of Eastern Germany. Supposedly as a democracy, we were trying to protect against that stuff. But here it is being brought into our own country. This is one of the projects they also mentioned, Project Servitor. And if you look at what that is about, it's all fear. Fear of terrorism, report your neighbour, watch out for suspicious stuff. This is fear and more fear, with the caveat that you mustn't be brave enough to do anything about it. You must run, hide and tell. So why would I be suspicious about what happened to those women after talking to online actors? Well, let's remind ourselves about the Lee Rigby case. Here is attackers, Michael Adebolajo and Michael Adebowale. And why should we be interested? Well, these two both ended up in prison. One of them has ended up in, I think it's Broadmoor. That's apparently going to cost £250,000 a year, according to the Sun. That's what they said. But at the time, we reported on this, and we'll do it very quickly. Here was Michael Adebolajo, and the first thing to note is that in his early years, he was good friends with a soldier who later was killed in Iraq. So we have a young man brought up as a Christian, friendly with an army person serving over in Iraq. But what then took place? Well, basically, we start to go through a system where he's recruited by MI5 at university to infiltrate Muslim groups. We come out here in 2010, he's sent to work to Al-Qaeda in Somalia. Well, that's what we believe was going on. In 2010, he's arrested in Kenya under suspicion of involvement in the CIA Al-Qaeda plot. This all came out of mainstream reporting. And later the family said that he was tortured before being deported to Britain, where he was pestered by MI5. And indeed, in 2012, it is on record that he was contacting a lawyer trying to escape MI5 harassment. So was this an entrapment? Well, if you don't like going that side, then over to his friend, Mr. Adebowale, also raised as a Christian, but he becomes involved with some Somali groups. And then he is in prison, Feltham Young Offenders, where it appears that he converts to Islam. And his personality changes. What we said at the time was significant is this was reported in the Mirror, but all of a sudden the Mirror story is taken down, never to be seen again. Why was that? And then the BBC reported this gentleman, Mr. Hassan, who also was talking about MI5 harassing and attempting to draw these men into activities. Who was at the centre of all this? Well, let's remind ourselves it was none other than Malcolm Rifkin, who was later grossly, undermined by his role in some dodgy business deals. But of course, it was Malcolm Rifkin that defended the activities of the security services. So I think we have to say people need to make their minds up, but I have an uneasy sense when I see talk of online actors. What are these people doing? And to whom are they accountable? Well, that brings us nicely perhaps onto Demos. Fascinating report yesterday, which I watched from home, Mike. And don't forget, here's Demos, and they are champion of people, ideas and democracy, but I suggest it's theirs in all three cases. So if you haven't seen some of their material, they list it out. They tell you that they've got people's best interests at heart. And they also go on to say that we listen to people from all walks of life. We use rigorous research methods, including machine learning and big data, to understand social trends. So you shouldn't worry about these people because everything that they're doing is to actually look after us. So who are the people? Well, I thought it'd be interesting just to have a look at a few of them. This is Polly Mackenzie. She's the director. She started her career as a business journalist but in 2004 she became a policy advisor on housing and local government. That's a pretty impressive step, Mike. How do you actually do that? You're a journalist and suddenly you're working on government policy, and you're serving as Director of Policy to the Deputy Prime Minister from 2010-15. If you look at her age, with great respect to this lady, at the time she was helping formulate policy, it's a wonder she's got any experience to comment on it at all. But I don't know. We'll leave you to think about that. Tesco. Well, this is another one of the trustees, and encourage people to go and have a look at this, a lady called Alessandra. And what does it say here? Well, she's working with an independent law firm, Mishcon de Rea, LLP, where she's responsible for international strategy. But she also worked for the government, Department of International Trade, and prior to government, she was head of UK government affairs at the retailer Tesco. I found this fascinating, Mike, that Tesco as a supermarket should be running its own government departments. So government to Tesco and back. But we've got another man here, Damien Leeson. And what can we show? Well, at Tesco, he was trustee of the Tesco Charitable Trust. So supermarkets to Demos without any problem at all, but also big banking interests, so Lloyds Bank and others. And I think you've got some comments on this
yes,
side.
because I just was interested in this role of UK Government Relations Manager at Tesco. So here is the role. This was the last time it was advertised. I think this was September, October last year. And what do they say about it? They say this is an exciting role for a dynamic, motivated individual to be an integral part of Tesco's government relations team. So they have a whole team on this. And engage effectively on political developments and policy formulation with a particular focus on Westminster and Whitehall. The post holder will be expected to help shape and deliver Tesco's engagement with the government, trade bodies, politicians and policymakers. They will identify opportunities and risks to the business and respond to those appropriately by planning and implementing effective influencing strategies. So what are they doing? Using behavioural change techniques on government? Is that what they're up to?
Whining and dining.
But, they're talking about developing and maintaining expertise, draft senior level speeches, draft engagement materials, engage with trade bodies, represent Tesco at meetings with parliamentarians, policymakers and other relevant stakeholders. But again, they talk about integrated campaigns involving proactive influencing opportunities. So what's interesting about this, we'll come on to in a second, I think, is that Tesco, Theresa May was meeting the Business Advisory Council last night or yesterday, and there's a whole range of companies that seem to have this type of setup. But maybe we're coming onto that in a second.
Okay, you've actually got that one.
Oh yes,
as well.
just to let everybody know, this is the current head of UK Government Relations at Tesco PLC, William Blomfield. You can see that he's also been head of EU Government Relations as well, so he's been doing this at an EU level too.
Yeah, okay, well that's good. So we've got the supermarkets now taking a tighter and tighter, a bigger and bigger control over the nation's food supplies. We've got Sainsbury's in there as well. Somebody in the chat box has just pointed out, of course, that Lord Sainsbury is fully engaged with government as well. So pretty good. Get your supermarket and then you get your voice heard in government. So we jump back to Demos just to finish it off. So some more trustees here. Ian Corfeld, currently Chief Commercial Officer at New Day, one of the largest issuers of credit cards in the UK. So there we are. We've got bankers, we've got Tesco people, but they're working in Demos because they've got our best interests at heart. And we've got this other gentleman here, Matt Nixon. And if you have a look in the encircled box, it's telling you that for Barclays, he helped set up and manage the SALTS review into the bank's business practices in 2012. So bankers, Tesco's, they're all working for in our best interests, according to Demos. I'm not sure I'm convinced about this, Mike, actually.
No. But then we come on to Neil Sherlock.
Well, we'll do him pretty quickly as well. So, partner at PricewaterhouseCoopers. I had to have a bit of a laugh at this because down at the bottom he starts waxing lyrical about playing golf tournaments at a young age and playing cricket, and I thought that was a bit nostalgic.
Well, indeed.
And
yeah.
if Demos is going to stamp out nostalgia, maybe he's on a bit of a loser there. But the nostalgia that they want to forget pretty quickly is where they came from. And if you start to look back, you have to go to other sites now because this has all been removed from Demos' own website. But of course, they were started by Martin Jacques, former editor of Marxism Today, and he was helped by Jeff Mulgan. So pretty deep political stuff. And UK Column did a lot of work exposing where Jeff Mulgan stood working alongside Julia Middleton and Francis Maud in that common purpose team inside the Conservative government. And that arrangement still exists. Some of the people have changed, but we can assure you that the Jeff Mulgan style communitarianism, common purpose, still alive and well inside the Tory party. But they say, trust us and our bankers and global corporatists to look after all you little people.
Well, in fact, the issue of Demos came up at the NHS conference, and a fantastic slide here from that conference, Demos founding board members launching the third way. We've got people on the left here that are coming from City of London, what might be considered conservative interests, and on the right-hand side there, you've got people like Jeff Mulgan and Anita Roddick and Martin Jacques, Stuart Hall. But big money on the left-hand side: Arthur Selden, Martin Taylor, Sir Douglas Haig, Bob Tyrrell, Graham Mather, Lord Dennis Stevenson, and so it goes on. Demos. People view Demos, Demos claims to be cross-party, but people view Demos as being pretty left-wing, and with Jeff Mulgan being one of the founders, it's hardly surprising. As you say, he was publishing Marxism Today at one point. Barclays, Goldman Sachs, Institute for International Affairs, people have been working for these types of organizations, Lehman Brothers, Credit Suisse, involved in setting this think tank up in the first place.
It's a vast network, a vast octopus, it might be one way of describing it, fingers in every single pie and every single think tank. And of course, it's the think tanks that are driving this amazingly brutal change politics in UK.
But look, we shouldn't be concerned about being nostalgic. That's clearly a negative thing to do. We've got to drop the nostalgia. We've got to drop all this backward looking. And we've got to get involved with their new project, which is called the Optimism Project. They've just announced this today. It is fantastic. The Optimism Project is a national conversation on what's best about Britain, what our assets and opportunities are, and where we can succeed. So there you go. What do they say in the main body of the report itself? They say that Britain is a troubled and angry nation. So we're nostalgic, we're angry. We've got to stop being angry. We've got to be optimistic. We've just got to forget about all the problems that we have and look forward optimistically. That's
to the future and more change.
Absolutely. So Demos wants to raise 250,000, 25, I can't remember the exact amount. It doesn't matter.
25,000.
25,000, yeah, to get started on the Optimism Project. I'm really looking forward to see the outcomes because clearly in this hugely angry nation, we need to deal with that through some sort of anger management.
Yeah. Mark, with an eye on time, we're really starting to see this. A few people have said in the chat box, this is fascism coming into play. I think more accurately, it's communitarianism, but it's a fine dividing line.
Well, remember, they like to call the populists and the nationalists fascists, but in fact, they are the merger of corporate and government functions. But Demos is a particularly interesting think tank. You're seeing the even more intense manipulation of language. You see it with globalese, as I talk about with the Chicago Global Affairs Council, with the Global Cities Movement, all the dodgy and brainwashing kind of language. Demos seems to have taken brainwashing to a whole new level. Demos, of course, is a prefix that means people. So even that's misleading. They're obviously not really for the common people. And it's just really terrifying that they're basically saying that you have no anchor in the past. In effect, the past is irrelevant. But we remember Orwell, he who controls the past controls the future. So one technique of controlling the future is to actually act like we don't have a past, or at least not any past worth deriving ideas from. But we know that, for instance, tariffs do have a place. Tariffs aren't necessarily a bad thing. We do know that our own money that is not borrowed from banks can be a good thing. And once happened once upon a time with the Bradbury Pound. We can take things from the past and institute them into the future and modernize them. But they want to close that door completely. And that is one of the most tyrannical things I've seen conceptually, probably in my whole journalistic career.
Mark, thank you very much for that. Sorry, we lost video on you there. So that's for our viewers and listeners, listeners, why we only had the audio. We were going to cover some material on the NHS. We're on the stops for time, so I think we'll bring that in tomorrow. But that is UK column news for today. And I think our major message is we can see that the present government in power is pursuing an agenda for its own satisfaction. There is nothing here for the people of Britain. There is something much darker and more sinister going on. And yes, it's absolutely a mixture of politics, banking and big business. And we'll call that communitarianism. Did you vote for it? We certainly didn't. If you want to stop it, we need to expose it. Thanks for joining us. We'll be back at the same time tomorrow. Bye-bye.